So it's June 24th. We're here with Bill Baue of r3.0, who is about to tell us a little bit about kind of the evolutionary arc that initiative has been on.
Okay, thanks, Ben. And so R3.0 is the new name. We just had our conference on Monday and Tuesday of last week, the 17th and 18th of June in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And there we announced a new name based on really sort of long-standing engagement from our community who were saying, look, reporting is really only a tiny slice of what you do. You have a purview that's much larger than that. And so we made the decision to do a name change, talk to our steering board, did input from our community. And actually one of our community members, one of our advocation partners, proposed the idea of r3.0 to retain. We were already using that regularly as a sort of an abbreviation, but it encompasses right now the idea of redesign for resilience and regeneration, which is something that we have been focusing on throughout. And so this was in some ways just a formalization of the broader focus that we've got. So what I'll do is just give a very brief sense of our anchoring in the past and how that bridges into where we're heading now and into the future, by giving a couple of examples based on the conversation that we had just been having. One area is around the multiple capitals. So, we base our work on the multiple capitals, looking very closely at the history of the development of those ideas and really seeing capital not as inherently financial, which is how many people understand it. And it's one of the sort of Achilles heels of using that term, because there's a perception that it would necessarily sort of kowtow, I guess you might say, to a financial focus. But if you really look at the literature and the practice, there are really quite deep roots to the idea of a capital being a resource stock that generates flows of goods and services that humans and other species use to support our well-being. So really the core idea is that a capital is a resource stock that we human beings have both an opportunity and an obligation to manage those stocks and flows at levels that are necessary to continue to support our own well-being and the well-being of sort of the biota that we live in and share this world with. So the main thing that we're advocating for is evolving the notion of capitals into looking at what we call the carrying capacities of the capitals. And one way to understand the idea of carrying capacity is actually thanks to Andrew Sims, who we were just mentioning before, the former head of the New Economics Foundation. In his latest book, Cancel the Apocalypse, he's got a section that tells the history of the Plimsoll line. And the Plimsoll line is something that you'll see on the side of every commercial boat, ship. And it's basically the line, it's the sink or swim line, if you will. So back in the late 1800s, the shipping companies were just loading down their ships as much as they could, sending them off to sea, and hundreds of ships were sinking because they were overloaded because, ironically, their business model was, well, we can lose a few hundred ships and the lives associated with it because we get enough of them come through that it's economically viable. And Plimsoll was just aghast at this. And so he, created legislation that sets the Plimsoll line. And that was the first real establishment of the idea of carrying capacity.
So what a metaphor!
I've built that slide. I just presented it for the first time at the International Integrated Reporting Council conference in London recently, and I'll share a little bit more about that in a moment. But it went over really well. So, Tjeerd Krumpelman from ABN AMRO came up to me afterwards and he said, Bill, I've been trying to wrap my head around your guys' talk of thresholds and allocations, and the Plimsoll line really is what made it visceral. So that's essentially what we're doing, is we're applying the notion of carrying capacity across all the capitals. And another, helpful metaphor with that is Kate Rayworth's donut. So her donut is essentially an outer Plimsoll line for ecological impacts. So we've got a line or a threshold that, if you're thinking of it in terms of climate change, it would be 350 parts per million, or 1.5 degrees, or 680 gigatons of carbon. That's sort of the threshold. With water, it's on a watershed basis. It's the amount of renewable water in a given time cycle. And you could use the metaphor of day zero in Cape Town, which was just barely averted recently, where they basically had used up all of their available water and were going to go into not having enough water for the city. So that's the concept that we've been applying. And on the social side, of course, it's a lower limit. So Kate Rayworth's social foundations. Yes, there we go. Thank you. And I can throw a Plimsoll line up there potentially in a moment. So this is the approach that really is the core of our work, is the notion of applying thresholds, and allocations would just be the pie. So if you've got a resource and it's one pie, you have to split that resource up in some kind of fair and just and proportionate way. And so we advocate for, instead of doing that in an invisible way, which is what's always happening. Our markets are always divvying up resources. They're just doing it based on supply and demand, or based on political power that's often invisible. So we're just advocating, hey, since we have to divvy up these resources, let's do it in a transparent way, where we're looking at the commons, we're recognizing that all human beings have an inherent right to resources from the commons that are necessary for their well-being. So again, well-being of humans and other, all species is sort of the core end point, if you will. And we're drawing that inspiration from Donella Meadows, who placed that at the top of what she calls the daily triangle. So to give this some sort of specific examples, we have a partnership with the International Integrated Reporting Council, which I mentioned earlier. They're a global initiative that's basically trying to take sustainability reporting and traditional financial reporting and fuse them together so that we get an integrated picture of an organization. And they have embraced the multiple capitals, but they never talked about the carrying capacities of the capitals. And so we have a project with them that we're releasing a white paper at the end of this year to essentially integrate the carrying capacities of the capitals into their existing thinking. So that's one tangible example of what we've done in the past that's really, focused on reporting, but has broader implications. The second example that I'll give ties into what we were talking about earlier in terms of indicators. So we had briefly mentioned Mark Anielski's work on the economics of happiness, this book, and the fact that he was taking a 5 capitals approach. So that's how we got into the question of capitals. And then the idea of indicators for that. So currently reporting r3.0 is finishing up. I'm literally doing it this afternoon, putting the finishing touches on a report for UNRISD, the United Nations Research Institute on Social Development. So that was a project that's looking to define sustainable development indicators. And what we've done is come up with a 3-tiered typology for that. The first tier is just existing indicators that are incremental in nature. So most of the indicators that are used are measuring some kind of progress in the right direction. So, if you look at any company, we use Unilever as an example. Unilever is sort of a poster child for very good, strong sustainability performance. But if you look at their actual indicators, sustainability is nowhere to be found in them. So they're just saying, we're going to reduce our carbon emissions by X amount. We'll give you an absolute number, and then we'll give you a number, an intensity number. And that's sort of reduction in emissions compared to a unit of production. So something like that. So we use this as an example to say, basically all existing indicators are incremental indicators. They're not bad. They're just not sufficient. They're what you would call necessary, but not sufficient. So the second tier is what would be called context-based or threshold-based indicators. And those are ones where you actually give the sustainability goal line. You say, okay, if we're talking about climate, then we have to be measuring progress against an IPCC threshold, for example. And hi.
Hi.
Thanks, Ben. So I was just explaining this United Nations Research Institute for Social Development project that we're working on, and had mentioned the first tier of incremental indicators, which is what most indicators are now. The second tier is what you might call threshold-based indicators. And so those are indicators that are actually have some clear tie-in to a goal line that defines sustainability. And so, if it's we used watershed earlier, on a watershed basis, that would be the total amount of water that's available in a watershed, and the ways that it's shared with the various users in that watershed. So that's an approach that would be actually measuring sustainability, instead of most indicators right now are just like, well, here's how we're using less water year to year, but not saying, well, is that reduction sufficient to meet the demands of the watershed? Or on the social side, the difference between a minimum wage and a living wage. So a living wage would be a threshold-based approach. This is how much a human being or a family needs to actually survive with some moderate level of comfort in this particular economy, the regional economy that they're in, as compared to minimum wage, which is just essentially an arbitrary number that's politically acceptable. And so, we could talk for a long time about the problems with that. But the point here is that indicators or measurements or approaches that actually look at literal sustainability are necessary when we're in a world that is empirically unsustainable. So we can prove that we are unsustainable in how we're acting. And so if we want to achieve sustainability, the idea behind this project is that we need to bake that into our systems. And so I'll give one quick hands-on example around climate. So in about 2012, I was noticing that the greenhouse gas emissions protocol, which is sort of what all companies use to quantify their emissions, has no tie-in to the IPCC science. I mean, that's what it's created because of the climate science coming out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but it didn't actually tie back into those thresholds that are identified by the IPCC. And so I shared this with colleagues. Long story short, what ended up happening is that this organization called the Science-Based Targets Initiative launched in about 2013 or 2014. I'm continued to be on the technical advisory group of that. By now, if you go onto their website, they've got, something like 500 companies in a relatively short period of time have signed up to not just reduce their carbon emissions, but reduce them the amount that the climate science says that they need to. Now, we could have a longer conversation about whether even that is enough, but it's at the very least aligning their activities, their performance, their impact directly with the science. So that's one example of tier 2 indicators. And then tier 3 indicators are even more exploratory, I guess you would say. And those are transformation indicators. So the UNRISD, asked us to look around and see what indicators exist for transformation. So essentially moving from the what, the tier 1 and tier 2 indicators focus on what, and tier 3 would be more on how. So how do we create the transformation necessary? And the short answer there is there aren't really, we're just in the process of developing those kinds of indicators. And so I spoke with Steve Waddell, who's doing a SDG transformation initiative, and they're actively working on that. So they have a paper that I refer to that sort of says, here's where things stand right now in terms of transformation indicators. So with all of that as a kind of foundation of the work that Reporting 3.0 had done going up until this conference, as I was saying earlier, we just had our global conference, our 6th international conference last week on June 17th and 18th in Rotterdam at Erasmus University. And from my perspective, and I think my colleague Ralph Thurm would share this, there was a kind of an organic shift in focus that happened during that conference. And it really was during the 2 keynote addresses from Joe Brewer, who was there representing the Capital Institute and their Regenerative Communities Network. So he's the community catalyst, or actually it's a different title that he's got. I forget what it is, but he's essentially organizing that initiative. And then Kate Rayworth talking about the donut economics. So as I mentioned earlier, the ecological ceilings and social foundations that we need to get within that sweet spot space, the kind of Goldilocks space between ecological ceilings, overshoot, and social foundation underperform. And so Kate was also giving an example of a very place-based application of the donut economics, focusing on a case example from Amsterdam, which was just a few kilometers away from Rotterdam. So what this did was Reporting 3.0 actually the seed had been planted 4 years ago at the 2015 conference when John Fullerton, who's the head of the Capital Institute, made what he called a sort of a provocation to our community. And he said, look, I know that you guys deal mostly with corporates and investors, but, it isn't the right focus of attention the bioregion. And so he proposed that in 2015, and it's been sort of in the background of our thinking ever since then. But it was really, Joe's talk, which really sort of blew everyone away. He did a sort of a brief history of economics as they've developed, and they are predicated on essentially linear, to use the technical term, linear thermodynamic mathematics. So basically linear thinking is the foundation of our economics. And subsequent to that development, the sciences developed complexity science and systems science and such that showed that really we live in a nonlinear, non-equilibrium thermodynamic world. So using those technical terms, essentially it's saying that our economics hasn't caught up to our broader scientific understanding of how systems interweave with one another. And so he used that as a sort of landing pad for the idea that really, in what we as humanity need to be doing is reorganizing ourselves on a bioregional basis. That bioregions are essentially, that's the way that nature organizes a geographic area, not by the sort of arbitrary political lines that have been drawn. So this is an idea that essentially, I would say, we at r3.0, as we shift in name from reporting to more explicitly a broader purview, we're also thinking about applying our focus, and in particular our transformation journey program, to something beyond the corporate and investment and accounting and traditional business settings, and instead applying them, or not instead, in addition, applying them to a bioregional community basis. So that's, Ben and I, in preparing for this session, we essentially talked about the idea of asking how does that sound? Where's the interest level in really focusing on a bioregional basis? And it really seemed like it intersected with the core question of the now what inquiry in generative, fruitful ways. So I think I'll, using that as a foundation, maybe pass it back to Ben to sort of do your weaving magic in terms of, here's what r3.0 is doing. Remind us of what this overarching deep dive dialogues are doing, and take it from there.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I wonder, before I do that, if you want to say just a little bit more about how you see the work you've been doing in the context primarily of the reporting of corporate activity in terms of different capitals, and the different tiers that you laid out, which I thought were fascinating, and in particular fascinating that third tier, how do we measure the degree to which we're bringing forth the new paradigm and the new systems that are needed, that we haven't even begun to figure that out. We get stopping the bad, that's kind of easy, relatively speaking, even though we're failing pretty miserably even there, but
right.
But to say, in then translating all of that work into a bioregional focus, and what you think you might have to offer with that to people that are organizing already bioregionally, because there certainly is, that is a huge movement, as of course, and I'm a part of some stuff in New England in that regard, as well as connected to people doing work in other regions, and we've even talked about the possibility of this deep dive process, another iteration of it, being focused specifically on bioregional organizing, and how do we advance and support the work that's being done around the world there. So I'm just curious to hear you say a little more about the tools and the processes, the programs you've been developing might directly be of service to people already engaged in that work or wanting to be involved in it.
Yeah, no, thanks. I do think that's we call it a necessary sort of baseline understanding. So what I'll do is I'll just explain the Reporting 3.0 Transformation Journey program is the literal workshop program that we've been implementing in predominantly corporate but also educational settings, and then sort of use that to explain how we are starting to think about the idea of expanding that to apply in other contexts. So the Transformation Journey program is something that we produced the curriculum for that, essentially, based on the 4 existing blueprints. So Reporting 3.0, when we were Reporting 3.0, the process that we followed was to identify an area, and we chose 4 of them to begin with, of reporting, accounting, data, and new business models. And we basically said, well, if we're going to transform the corporate and investment realms, that those are sort of the four foundations that we would need to look at. So in each of those blueprints, we basically looked at where's the field right now, where's reporting, where's accounting, where's data, where's business models right now, and what's their current level of ambition. What's the furthest that they're seeking to progress. And our hypothesis was that they're always going to fall short of what's actually necessary to transform in order to become sustainable. And that's essentially what we found in each of these. And so the transformation journey program or blueprint basically just melded all four of those blueprints into one articulation and gave a kind of an implementation methodology. So we used that to say, okay, let's implement that blueprint, that curriculum, if you will, in a workshop setting, and we ran it at hosted by ING, a big lender in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and then we ran it hosted by Manulife, or known in the United States operating as John Hancock, the insurer. So obviously, sort of mainstream traditional financial organizations that have some interest or orientation towards sustainability. And where it gets to the question that you're asking, Ben, or sort of the relevance, can we expand this more broadly? Essentially the beginning of the transformation journey program is agnostic to context. It's agnostic to whether it's a corporate context or an investment context. It's basically like, what's the data that says that we need to transform? Like, first, let's start with first things first. And so the transformation journey program starts by, giving a distilled view of what the data is that suggests that we need to transform our existing system. And so what our belief is that body of information that we've built into a curriculum can serve as the foundation for then applying this thinking to a bioregional context. And even at the bioregion, organizations are still going to need to look at whether their own impacts are operating within the donut, so to speak. So we've basically structured our approach to not necessarily just apply to large organizations. They could apply to smaller organizations. So just to give a hands-on example, with our new business models blueprint, we actually just did case studies of smaller startup organizations instead of just focusing on the larger ones. So, we did a small startup in the Netherlands called Reblend, which is taking back fabric and recycling that fabric so that it creates more of a closed loop system. And then here in the United States, we did a case example of Co-op Power, which is based in my neck of the woods. It's basically an incubator of cooperative business models in the energy space. And so they've incubated, I think, about 24 different companies and initiatives using their core model. And so our belief is that kind of incubation and scaling, but instead of scaling up, it's more like scaling across a region. So these are things that suggest that a transformation journey program could be implemented on a bioregional basis, in particular, collaborating with Joe Brewer and the Capital Institute in some of the work that they're creating around first mapping the region, identifying players who are already active, and then saying, how do these initiatives fit together ideally to make a shift on a bioregional basis? to a regenerative economy and regenerative society and community. So that's sort of the thinking in a nutshell. And again, this is very provisional. Haven't even really talked about this with r3.0 with Ralph Thurm yet. It just sort of organically arose from the conference.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Bill. That's really exciting and fascinating to hear, and I think will set us up now to have a conversation based on that.